A group of big city mayors are calling on Congress to investigate the use of federal officers in Portland, Oregon. Federal officers targeted protesters with tear gas and flashbangs again overnight. Demonstrators have been gathering for nearly 2 months, protesting police violence following the death of George Floyd. NBC News correspondent Erin Mclaughlin joins me now from Portland. Erin, what's happening there today?
Hey, Savannah, well, let me just step out of the way and show you the scene here outside of the federal courthouse. This has been a flashpoint in the confrontation between agents and protesters. As you can see there, they're power washing outside, clearing out the remnants of last night's tear gas. They just set up today that steel barricade. Now, that barricade has actually come down twice now. Protesters stormed the barricade. They've been able to breach it on 2 occasions and tear parts of it down, each time putting it back up again. You can see this time, though, if you notice to the right there, reinforcing the barricade is that steel, the cement sort of wall there. So clearly, authorities are trying their best to make sure that that is not able, or the protesters are unable to bring that down again as the city bracing for the possibility of more violence. Last night's violence was very similar to previous nights that we had seen before. Protesters storming the federal courts. Last night, they tried to set fires to some of the planks that were set up on the windows. They also confronting federal agents, beaten back with tear gas and batons, and then, of course, the violence clearing out in the early morning of the hours. Now the situation is, as you can see, pretty calm here, but very clearly they're bracing for the possibility of another encounter tonight, Savannah.
And now, Erin, I know you've been there. You've been seeing what's been happening. You've been speaking with protesters. One actually who was arrested by federal agents last night. What did she tell you?
Yeah, I spoke to Jennifer Christensen. She's a lawyer. She's a mother of 2. She's part of the so-called Wall of Moms, mothers here in Portland, coming together to confront federal agents. She described to me what happened when she was arrested. She said that she has been charged with 2 charges, one of hitting or assaulting a federal agent, charges that she disputes. She told me why she feels important to come out here, especially late at night when all the rioting is going on. Take a listen to what she had to say.
What has been happening to communities of color, to Black moms, to Indigenous communities, to immigrant communities, it has to stop. It has to stop. And if it takes a bunch of white bodies on the line to get attention to make it stop, it shouldn't. It should not take that. But if that's what it takes, I'm going to be there for that. As horrible as it was, that is what we have been seeing in Black bodies for decades. Family seeing me get picked up is terrible, but I'm home. They're not home. They didn't get to go home.
Now, she is one of many protesters that I've spoken to who say they want to be out here. They want their voices heard. They want to be able to exercise their constitutional rights, that they are not anarchists, as the president has painted all protesters involved in the clashes that we've seen, that they have actual grievances, that they're peaceful, and they want their voices heard.
What a powerful interview. Those images of the Wall of Moms really are also just something so powerful. Now, Oregon's Attorney General is in court today taking action of her own. What does she want done?
Yeah, that's right. It was a hearing that took place over the course of an hour and a half. It actually happened inside the federal courthouse just behind me. And essentially, she is arguing that federal agents here need to have a restraining order. She wants a restraining order against the Department of Homeland Security, as well as several agencies, pointing to what she argues are illegal arrests that have happened here in Portland, pointing specifically to the case of one protester by the name of Mark Pettibone, 29 years old. According to his account, he was approached by federal agents who did not represent who they were, did not say who they were. They pulled him into an unmarked van. He said he was completely terrorized. She's pointing to that, as well as other social media accounts, as evidence that this restraining order is necessary. Now, the federal government in court today did not dispute the account of Mark Pettibone in their arguments, but they did say that that is something that can be addressed in civil courts, that instituting a temporary restraining order would be an overreach of sorts. That was their argument. Now it's with a judge unclear when we're going to get a ruling on her application for the temporary restraining order. Savannah.
Thanks so much, Erin. Stay safe.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.